Do modern fighter jets really need guns? That's gotta be the most controversial question you can ask in military aviation today. And anytime it comes up, you can be sure you'll hear from someone who will tell you that it was the F-4 Phantom II's lack of guns that ultimately led to the United States struggling in air combat during the Vietnam War. And make no mistake, the US did struggle. During the Korean War, American F-86 Sabres averaged a 10-to-1 kill-to-loss ratio. In other words, they shot down 10 enemy aircraft for every one F-86 America lost. During the Vietnam War, the overall average for all American aircraft dropped to about 5.5-to-1. But in certain windows of time, the average was significantly worse than that, sometimes dropping below 1-to-1, meaning America was losing more aircraft than it was shooting down. Overall, between 1962 and 73, the US lost about 1,737 fixed-wing aircraft over Vietnam, not counting accidental crashes. And to make matters even worse, many of those aircraft were lost to dated Soviet MiG-17s and MiG-21s, aircraft that were not nearly as fast but were more nimble than the American fighters they were squaring off against. And the F-4's lack of guns is consistently blamed for that poor performance. But the truth is, a lack of guns was the least of America's concerns. While lots of tactical aircraft were involved in the Vietnam War, the F-4 Phantom II was really America's primary air superiority fighter at the time. But it wasn't built to dogfight. It was a high-speed interceptor with low visibility from behind and engines that would produce massive smoke trails that were recorded stretching for more than 30 miles, making it extremely easy to track where these aircraft were. Now, as an interceptor with a powerful onboard radar and radar-guided air-to-air missiles like the Am7 Sparrow, the F-4 Phantom II did have an advantage when it came to first shot opportunity. But that advantage was tossed in the trash, thanks to a combination of bad tactics and even worse rules of engagement. You see, Air Force fighter pilots were trained to fly air combat missions in Vietnam in a World War II era formation known as the Fluid 4. Now, the problem with the Fluid 4 formation is that flying in such close proximity to one another meant that the wingmen weren't really able to protect one another, and really only the lead aircraft could leverage ordnance against a target, effectively limiting the combat power of 4 aircraft down to 1. Now, the Navy usually flew in Fluid 2 formations, which was far more effective, and the Air Force did eventually change things up. But even if they did, the rules of engagement dictated that the F-4s could not fire upon an opponent until they made visual confirmation that it was an adversary fighter. In other words, even though they had weapons that could engage at long range, they couldn't engage at any longer range than their eyes could see. And to make matters even worse, the Am7 Sparrow sucked. It was a semi-active radar-guided weapon, which means you had to keep your radar locked on the target right up until the missile hit. And even when you did, it still had a pretty abysmal kill rate. Between 1965 and 1968, 224 Am7 Sparrows were fired at enemy aircraft, resulting in only 20 kills. And to make matters even worse, policy dictated that pilots were rotated out of Vietnam after 100 combat missions, meaning there was always a steady supply of inexperienced pilots coming in. And that was made so much worse by how lackluster and poor American air combat training was at the time. You see, in the years leading up to the Vietnam War, the US Air Force and Navy prioritized safety above all else when it came to air combat training. And as a result, no pilots got to fly in very realistic air combat exercises. And even when they did train for air combat, they trained against other fighters of the same type, which is obviously not what they'd be squaring off against when they got to Vietnam. Now, both the Navy and the Air Force recognized and acknowledged this mistake, and the Air Force established their massive red flag large-scale air combat exercises, which these days will regularly see dozens, if not hundreds of aircraft hailing from multiple nations around the world, all squaring off in massive, very realistic air combat simulations. For the Navy's part, they established the Navy Fighter Weapons School, which was later renamed the Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, but you probably know it as Top Gun. In the years since the Vietnam War, the US has gotten rid of the Am7 Sparrow and dramatically improved the Am9 Sidewinder, not to mention investing heavily into a whole variety of large-scale, highly realistic air combat exercises. And as a result, American fighter pilots are now recognized as among the most highly trained and experienced aviators in the world. So did American fighter pilots struggle in Vietnam because the F-4 didn't have guns? Not really. It would have helped in some situations, but not in many others. The truth is, there were a litany of problems that resulted in America's air warfare Vietnam woes, and fixing it took a lot more than just strapping a gun pod to the F-4.